Welcome to Science Friday. This is a joint presentation with the Neighborhoods Committee. The Neighborhoods Committee is involved because we love David B. Williams' writing and his books, but when we talked about it at the meeting, they said, hey, Ginny, it's not about Seattle neighborhoods. So we graciously got invited to be included with Science Friday, and thank you for that. Many of you know David from his presentations here. The first book I was introduced to was Too High and Too Steep, the book about how the Seattle landscape got changed, particularly like in the Belltown neighborhood and around. A fabulous book to read. One of my new acquaintances just moved to Seattle, and I said, okay, this is the first book you have to read. Then David wrote also Home Waters, A Human and Natural History of Puget Sound. And if you haven't read that book, I think it's a must-read for somebody who lives in the Pacific Northwest. Waterway, The Story of Seattle Locks and Ship Canal, he collaborated with Jennifer Ott. And they showed us again how people thought about ways to shift the landscape of Seattle to move dirt and open up a connection many different ways from Lake Washington to Lake Union and out to Puget Sound. And then he also wrote Seattle Walks, Discovering the History and Nature in the City. And he recently communicated that he's rewriting that book. And if people have suggestions for things that have changed since it was originally written, he's open to receiving some input on that. If they're nice. People are nice to you. So, but today, what David's going to talk about is his newest book, Spirit Whales and Sloth Tales, Fossils of Washington State. What's wonderful about David, I'll say he puts out a weekly newsletter, and there's a card on the table here if you don't get that weekly newsletter. But he is a curious person. And he sees things in Seattle and brings our attention to it. It could be about flora and fauna. It could be about animals. It could be about geology, which is really your background. But he's curious, and he wants us to be observant and curious too. And his weekly newsletter always brings attention to things that we might see. And if you're interested, again, this card tells you how to get a connection to that and about the books. I asked him to bring a few books, and he has these for sale for $25 for us today. You could pay cash or write a check to him. If a credit card, too. You're flexible.
I'll take
so.
all three if you want to pay 3 times.
Okay. But I haven't read it yet, but I just know that I'm going to be a wiser and more curious person after reading it. So Liz Nesbitt was going to come with him today. Liz Nesbitt is the curator of paleontology at the Burke Museum and earth sciences professor at the UW. Unfortunately, she's fallen to a seasonal bug, so she isn't able to be here today. But another thing that I love about your work, David, is that you find these people to collaborate with, and you really dig into the science and history of things. So you give us factual, in-depth information to make us wiser people about this place we live. So thank you so much for responding and coming today to be with us. What a joy to have you back. Thank you.
Outstanding. Well, thank you, Ginny, and thank you all for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be here again. I always enjoy coming to Horizon House. For one, to see people I've known for many years, but also just to share the stories with you and know that you all are interested and interesting people. So for me, it's a pleasure to be a part of this community. What I'd like to do today is start with a reading from the book, about 5 minutes long, and then talk a little bit about the book, the background, how did Liz and I come to write the book, and then end by looking at 3 of what we call the profiles in the book and sort of dive in a little bit about some of the science. in the book. So what I now have to do, wearing glasses, of course. In 2014, a construction worker near downtown Seattle found a tusk while excavating for a new building. Paleontologists from the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture soon arrived. They worked past midnight to unearth the delicate fossil, wrap it in protective plaster, and arrange transport to the museum for what turned out to be the remains of a mammoth that lived around 15,000 years ago. Also arriving were the media and onlookers, some of whom chanted, "Dig it up, dig it up, dig it up." For those who watched and participated in the discovery at South Lake Union, it was a thrilling time as the fossil remains connected viewers to a distant world recently scraped raw by a 3,000-foot thick sheet of ice. Seeing the tusk, they could imagine a chilly post-glacial scene of giant mammals, formidable predators, and plants recolonizing a barren landscape. Like all fossils, the tusk was a window into a past completely different from the urban one now found at this location. The onlookers who experienced those heady few hours are certainly not alone in succumbing to the allure of ancient time. Over the decades, uncounted numbers of people have had similar experiences, finding a fossil in Washington state and being tantalized by it and the connections it provides to the region's geologic past. No matter where you wander in Washington, you are never very far from the past and the fossil evidence of those who came before. And I just want to stop for 1 second. Ginny said that this is not a neighborhood book, and yet the fossil that I start with was found just a few blocks from here. So I think this is a neighborhood book. Not a lot of it is, but you know, I take what I can. So I'm honoring at least part of the neighborhood idea. In addition, apparently we wrote, you can find trilobites near the Idaho border, primitive horses on the Columbia Plateau, exquisite flowers in Republic, giant bird tracks near Bellingham, and curious bear-like beasts on the Olympic Peninsula. With abundant and well-exposed rock layers, Washington has fossils dating from Ice Age mammals only 12,000 years back to marine invertebrates more than 500 million years old. In order to help readers more fully appreciate what fossils have to tell us, we start Spirit Whales and Sloth Tales with a basic introduction to geology and specifically the geology of Washington state, along with an understanding of how plants and animals fossilize and how geologists determine the age of fossils. Again, a break. One of the things when we were working on the book was thinking about who our audience was, and we recognized that we were really trying to write a book that appealed and was written toward a general audience. This is not an academic book, it's not a field guide, and I'll come back to that later, but we wanted people who picked it up to have the background they needed to understand the story. So that's why we talk about the different aspects of the geological world, because it is very, as you can imagine, very connected to the paleontological world that we focus more on. We then follow in the book with 24 profiles that are the heart and most important part of the book. We see each of these profiles as a short story that fits into the broader story of life over time in Washington. Like paleontologists excavating fossils, the profiles are organized with the youngest first, allowing the reader to dig deeper and deeper, unearthing stories strata by strata. Interestingly, this was sort of a controversial part of developing the book, is with fossils, you have a couple of different ways to organize it. You could organize it by time, oldest to youngest, youngest to oldest. I guess theoretically you could organize them by size. You could organize them alphabetically, which seems a little bit odd. But we really wanted this idea of youngest to oldest in the sense that you are unearthing the stories. You keep getting deeper and deeper into time as we add more layers or subtract more layers as it goes along. And in each of these stories, we try to focus on a specific specific plant, animal, or environment. And we often tried to weave in human history and geology, and we always had a simple goal of fleshing out the details necessary for a deeper understanding that will help make the fossils come to life. Ultimately, our goal is for you to come away with a more thorough appreciation of the spectacular paleontology and geology of Washington state. So that's really what we were trying to do, was create a book that had this broad depth to it. And as you can see on here, Liz is listed as the lead author, and this really is Liz's book. I was really just along for the ride. Liz had this idea. She had been a paleontologist and curator at the Burke Museum for, I think, 30 some odd years. And so she had long been thinking about the idea of a book about paleontology in Washington. And if you wanted to find one previously, there was basically a little pamphlet about like a 5x7 pamphlet that came out, I think, in the 70s. So basically there was nothing available, which is really advantageous as a writer when you have nothing to compare with. So whatever you do looks really good. So we benefited by that aspect of the story. But Liz had the idea, and she started to think about how to do this. She reached out to the University of Washington Press. And the press was very excited about this, about crafting a book that really opened up this new market and more tell these stories that hadn't been told. So Liz starts thinking about it, and as she starts working on the book, she realizes that she unfortunately really still saw the world as an academic and had academic writing. Not that that's bad, but it doesn't always appeal to everybody. If you've ever read an academic paper and you've seen words like hegemony, whatever that means, it just scares me to have that in a book. So we didn't use hegemony. But Liz fortunately reached out to me. We had known each other. I worked at the Burke for about 15 years in education, and I had a lot of interaction with the curators. And Liz was always my favorite curator. One, she's from South Africa, and she has this lovely accent, and I'm sort of in love with her accent. My wife knows that, so it's okay. But she also, I knew, was a person who, even though she sort of saw the world in a very scientific manner and struggled with writing in a non-academic manner, I knew, though, that when she talked to groups and when she conversed particularly with people coming to the museum as visitors, she was able to convey that information in an understandable manner. And as I said, this book is not academic, and it's not for scientists. It's not a field guide. We didn't want a book that you go out and identify things. We wanted a book that had stories in it. We wanted a book that would engage people and get people, as Ginny said, to expand their curiosity, to feed their curiosity, to engage their curiosity. And that was really the driver behind the book, of thinking about ways we could do that. And as a writer, as Ginny said, that's what interests me. And for the last 20 plus years, I've been interested in that connection between people and place. How do we influence landscape? And how does landscape influence us? And this book, to me, was a perfect opportunity to take that in a slightly different direction. Primarily, I've focused on the urban environment or on Puget Sound and thinking about things that we walk by all the time, that we don't necessarily notice. That's always what interests me. It's what's in the newsletter a lot. But when Liz asked me to do this, I was like, wow, this is perfect. Because one, I wouldn't have to do the research. I love doing research, but Liz knows everything. She knows everything about fossils. So we would just sort of work together. She would write, we'd edit and go back and forth. And so I didn't have to worry about getting it right. I knew it was going to be right because she knows so much. I was just sort of helping the process along. And so as we started thinking about it, this idea of stories and profiles really leapt out at us, of focusing on an individual species or group. And I'll come back to that as I explore it at the end of the talk. But that was really what drove us on the book, of creating this very engaging book. And the other aspect, particularly we were both interested in, was telling the stories of people who collected the fossils. Yes, there are a lot of scientists who collect it, professionals or people who are very serious amateurs who collect it, but there are also just random people out there. I will have a story later on about two couples who are in eastern Washington who found what is arguably the most unusual fossil in Washington state. There was a school teacher out on the peninsula who liked to collect fossils and has found a couple different fossils, one of an animal that there's only 2 or 3 specimens of this animal found. It's called a colponomus. It's a sort of a curious otter-like bear animal out on the coast. But she found it, and her name wasn't in the literature as much, and we really wanted to honor and celebrate the fact that people, just like all of us, are out there finding fossils, sharing them, bringing them to light, so that then scientists could then find more information and share those stories. Another part of what we were trying to do, and Liz is someone who really pushed this, was the idea that paleontology has fundamentally changed over the last 30 years, and really throughout its time. If you look at the early collections of fossils, say the late 1800s in the western US in particular, you see a couple things. One, it was basically a bunch of white guys out searching, finding things as fast as they could, naming them as fast as they can, getting things mixed up. There's a famous story of one where they put the head on the complete wrong end of the animal. Sometimes they identify an adult. They'd have an adult and a juvenile, and they'd say they were two different species, even though they were one and the same. So that was really the early world of fossils. But in the last 30 years, fossils has fundamentally changed to, one, more diverse people finding fossils, and two, maybe more intriguing for what we were trying to do, was that people started to try and bring fossils to life. And as Liz said, when she first started to work on in paleontology, a lot of the papers were written by maybe just one or two people. Like, I wrote this paper, this is the work I did, it's about me, and yeah, the fossils are great. But now you look at it, and you see a paper, and there'll be 15 people on it. You'll have the statistician, you'll have the mathematician, you'll have the computer programmer, you'll have the doctor who helped out. Liz said as a paleontologist, it helps to befriend doctors, because then you can give them the fossils, and hopefully she'll take it to her lab and do an X-ray on it, or some other, XRF or an MRI on fossils, and you're able to find out a lot more information now than they used to. So it's this very interdisciplinary field, and it's very much a field about bringing an animal to life. And these are the stories that we were trying to convey, was to bring, as I've said several times, to bring the animals to life, that they're not static beasts, that they're animals and plants that had this relationship with the world around them, that they were being eaten, they were eating, they were part of an ecosystem, and so that's what we were throughout trying to do. So it's a combination of all these different things in the book. The cover we often get asked about, excuse me, not the cover, the title. Spirit Whales and Sloth Tales. So one of the whales in here is called, the sort of common name is a spirit whale. It comes from where it was found out on the peninsula, for a name in honor of the indigenous people out there. And that's another aspect. We're seeing names, and you probably, if you're a birder, you know there's a lot of controversy on birders and using human names in birds, but these fossils are starting to honor more people. That being said, there is a whale in the book that's named for Liz. And there's also, not in the book, but there's a very tiny, she said a little tiny mollusk that's also named for her. And that was pretty cool for me. I've never worked with anyone who had a fossil named for them. I thought, wow, that's... So, I mean, that just lends so much legitimacy to the book. And Sloth Tales, if you're not familiar with the sloth, the giant sloth, which is down here, which would be probably a little bit taller than I am, about 8 feet tall. This sloth was found at SeaTac Airport, not waiting, but in the security line, exactly, yeah. Fortunately, sloths cannot really hide anything, so the sloth made it through very quickly. But apparently, once it made it through the line, it fell into a hole in a lighting tower and died, and then was subsequently dug up. But that story of that animal and who found that animal, interestingly enough, when they found the specimen, they were able to excavate almost the entire animal, except the head, which had been slightly crushed. They're not sure exactly why. And when it was at the Burke, and this is a sort of a secret, I'm telling you, when that specimen was at the Burke, they had borrowed a head from somebody, well, some other sloth, and apparently the head was male and the body was female, or vice versa. So I guess they eventually figured it out. But that's, how things are. Life changes along the way. And again, getting back to this idea of science, the other part of it is that for me, one of the things I was trying to do in the book was sort of bring up some ideas of geology that I just think are really cool ideas and fun to share. And one of them gets back to this idea of life. We talk a couple chapters, we weave in what are called trace fossils. And those are the evidence left by an animal, say in mud, walking along the mud, or maybe somebody ate a leaf, or somebody pooped and that was fossilized. But what I think is amazing about this is, think about geology. One of the greatest contributions, I think, of geology to the ideas of the world is that this planet is 4.5 billion years old, and that idea of what John McPhee called deep time. And yet, within that deep time, we preserve individual moments in time. An animal walking across mud and leaving that footprint there. An animal eating a leaf. An animal pooping. I mean, there's actually also a fossil they think of an animal tinkling, which is even nuttier to think about. But not in Washington State, sadly, or it would be in the book, knowing me. But I think that's one of the ideas for me. And the other aspect of it, the idea that plays out throughout the book, is that no matter where you are on Earth, you're always missing more of the geologic story than that has happened. So even a place like the Grand Canyon with a mile of rock, there's still more time missing than has been preserved. And so in Washington, we have the same issue, that we have fossils from 12,000 to 500 million years old, but we also have big time gaps in Washington State where we have no fossils, no fossil record. And it's for a couple reasons. One is that Washington State is basically a big jigsaw puzzle. The oldest part of Washington, the sort of core of Washington, is in the northeastern corner. That section's about 500 million years old. But then, over time, plate tectonics brought little pieces of land. Geologists refer to these as terranes, T-E-R-R-A-N-E-S. And they're little slivers of rock, and little could be fairly large, dozens or hundreds of miles. And as the plate moved towards North America, that bit that's being carried on the plate gets sutured or added on to the continent so that you build it up layer by layer. So we don't always have rock layers from a variety of time periods because they weren't added to the area. The other problem with Washington State is we have lots of igneous rock. So we have volcanoes and we have the Columbia basalts. And igneous rock has this really good or bad habit, however you want to view it, of burying other rocks. And when you bury other rocks, you can't find them at the surface. And so we lose those stories. So there could be extensive fossils in eastern Washington, but it's all under the basalt, and we're never going to get to them. Or it could be under the area where the Cascades pushed up. Or as the Cascades were being pushed up, it could have just obliterated the fossils. So there's always more parts of the story missing than are present. So those are a little bit of the ideas of the story. What I'd like to do is see if I can make technology work by pushing a button and talk a little bit about the book, about some of the profiles. And one of them is this one right here, this fabulous profile that has, as you can see in it, I'm going to use, look at that. Woo. You've got your big mammal, the big elephant-like characters here and the bison here. This landscape was created, this image, not the landscape wasn't created, the image was created for the Burke Museum. And one of the things that we always think is, I find interesting is, how do they do this? How did they put together this story? This is an imagined landscape. There is no place in Washington that just has these type of mountains. We just wanted to create a landscape. This open habitat, and the big animals there. And this is right after the last ice age. So we know that in Washington, actually throughout, that there was, in the last ice age, there were a couple big sheets of ice. We had on the eastern edge over here, or the east side of the country, I guess most of the country, actually, the Laurentide ice sheet. And then where we are, the Cordilleran ice sheet. And the other thing to point out about this is Alaska was basically, there was no ice in Alaska, which sort of seems counterintuitive, but there wasn't. But what that happened is that during that period, a lot of water was taken up by the ice in a variety of these periods, and animals were probably crossing over what we call the Bering Land Bridge. So this is sort of the big picture, but then as you zoom in a little bit more, we get in Washington State. And this is the big lobe of ice called the Puget Lobe that extended down almost, to a little bit past Olympia. This, if you've heard my talks before, particularly about Puget Sound or about Too High and Too Steep, I always talk about this sheet of ice coming in and plowing into the landscape between the Olympics and the Cascades. And the two arrows make the point that what is not shown in this image, and that we tend to forget, is that the glaciers in the Cascades in the Olympics during the last ice age were much, much larger than they are at present. So this is a very icy landscape. Animals get pushed south, and then as the ice retreats, or that is really melting back to the north, the landscape changes, and these mammals and variety and plants move back into the area. We really had sort of two principal big animals. We had the mammoth and the mastodon, and the mammoth was the bigger of the two, a massive animal, as you can see there, about twice the size of the middle one, which is an African elephant, on the order of the mammoth on the order of 12 to 14 tons, and a mammoth, or an African elephant about 6 tons. So we did not have woolly mammoths in Washington. We had what are known as the Columbian mammoths. Woolly mammoths are more sort of a little bit more to the Midwest and more European. And then we had the mastodon, all in that group of animals that are related, even though the mastodon and mammoth are surprisingly different. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences. So here's the skeleton of a mammoth. And you can see this massive domed head. That's for the muscles to hold up these massive teeth, or the tusks that are in front. You can also see that they were very delicate. They sort of walked on their tiptoes down here like modern elephants do. But yeah, just a really beautiful, beautiful animal. And the teeth, what's really noticeable about the teeth is that the teeth are flat on the top. So they only had 4 molars in their mouth at a time. So they had one on the top, each side of their jaw. And they would have that molar until it wore out. And when they're eating, and they are an animal that's eating, they're a grazer, so they're eating grasses. They also probably brought up a lot of soil with a lot of silica in it that would wear down their teeth. And once their teeth were worn down, a new one would emerge in. Once that final set was worn down, they basically couldn't eat after that. And that was one of the ways they died, was basically bad teeth. So the mammoth looks like this. The mastodon teeth, a very different tooth. They are an animal that are evolved to eat rougher material, so leaves, eating branches. And so you can see the teeth with this much more crenulate or style of tooth. But so they're smaller and a very different animal, but both of them were in this part of the world. So we know that, of course, because of the fossils that have been found. Quite a few have been found in downtown, the South Lake Union, one that was found during some of the excavations for buildings in Seattle. People unearthed these fossils. And as I said, the sloth, which is not in this image, but it's in a different one, as I said, was waiting at SeaTac. So we go back to this image, and the other part of the image, not just the animals, of course, are the plants. And how do you figure out that story? Well, you figure that out by something that probably many of you don't like, of course, and that's pollen. Pollen is preserved extremely well, often when it falls in lakes, gets accumulated in the sediment. So this is a paleontologist, and this brown here is actually a core. So she would have had a tube that she sunk down into the sediment of this lake where she's near, pulls it up, and then through a surprisingly toxic chemical, requiring toxic chemicals, basically is able to dissolve out the material necessary and left behind with the pollen. When you have the pollen, you can look at it under a microscope, figure out what the species are, what plants are living there. And so through bones and through pollen, that was how they were able to reconstruct that story. And again, it's that interdisciplinary aspect of a variety of different people looking at a variety of different things, taking advantage of different technology. Anything as basic as just a core to sink down to much more advanced technology, as I say, using MRIs to figure out a little bit more about each of these animals. So that's one example. Another example, and this gets back to what I said, is arguably the most unusual fossil ever found in Washington, if not one of the most unusual fossils ever found in the world. This is known as the Blue Lake rhinoceros. And to place you in the landscape, this is Cooley City right here. You can see on your map just in eastern Washington, and then from Cooley City just outside it is the Blue Lake here. and what's called Jasper Canyon. And the story goes is that in July of 1935, two couples from Seattle were over exploring in eastern Washington, just poking around, I think looking for petrified wood, and they come up, go up a basalt cliff. And if you've been to eastern Washington, you know that the basalt forms layer after layer after layer after layer. So they're sort of working their way up this cliff, and they come across a hole, a cave. And they're like, well, that's sort of weird-looking cave. Turns out the cave is very flat on the bottom. And if you've spent any time in basalt, you know that it's usually very textured material, the way it cools, the way that lava cools. So that it's flat is sort of weird. But what also makes it weird is inside that cave is a jawbone. They collect it and bring it back to Seattle. They take it to the University of Washington, where there's no one who knows anything, apparently, there at that time. I'm just clarifying, at that time. It gets shipped over to eastern Washington, and the person looks at it and figures out, God, this looks like a rhinoceros. So he goes back over to the cave, and he's able to find it, goes up into the cave, and he realizes it's sort of flat on the bottom. It's about 8 feet long and maybe, about this 2 or 3 feet, about 3 or 4 feet high. And he notices at either end of the cave, there's sort of two holes in the cave. And he figures out, okay, well, this sort of, it clearly looks like a rhinoceros. And he thinks about this and eventually figures out, and through the help of some other researchers, they're able to determine that it was this rhinoceros. This drawing is from rhinoceros remains have been found more in the Midwest, where you find a lot more of these animals. But the story we think happened is about 15.8 million years ago. This rhinoceros was living in an environment in eastern Washington, an environment that was there's a lot of eruptions going on, basalt eruptions. So basalt, when it erupts out, just sort of oozes out very slowly and spreads across the landscape. So what we think happened is that this animal did what all animals do. It died. And it did what many animals do after they die. If they're just sitting there as it starts to bloat. But it's in a lake. So the animal's floating in a lake. And just perfect timing, a lava flow comes in, goes across the lake, gets cooled as it's going across the water, and basically forms a cast around the rhinoceros. So what they were seeing at this cave, at this entrance to the cave right here, I'm not sure why I'm walking over there, because I can just do this. And you can tell it's easy to find now because there are arrows there. So if you're ever looking, just go in eastern Washington and look for 2 arrows. You are here, exactly. I mean, it's great. But you go up to that, and what they think happens, the animal dies, lava comes, and basically preserves its shape in the cave, via the cave, and then there are bones left over. We have no idea how many bones were there previously. All we know is that when this couple first found it, they collected the jawbone and a few other bones. And as said, it was about 15.8 million years ago. If you really care from the technical, these are the 2 layers. But again, to me, it's just this great story. It's this mix. There's a great human element, there's a great geological element, and there's a great paleontological part of the story. Then there is the dinosaur. Now, Liz is a invertebrate paleontologist, so she likes things with backbones, and she is not a big fan of dinosaurs. But she lets me tell this story anyways. So where I'm going with this is to Susha Island. If you've been to Susha, up in the San Juans, at the sort of northwest corner, there are 2 parts. The island is sort of 2 parts of this horseshoe. And it's what's great about it is it really sort of in a microcosm the story of the jigsaw puzzle of Washington State. Because the north part of the island up here is a more sandy layer, about 45 million year old layer of sandstone. But if you go to the south side and you zoom in, there's a little area, it's hard to tell, but it says Fossil Bay right here. And this bay, the rocks there are 80-million-year-old marine deposits, so rock that was deposited in the ocean. So the north side, rocks deposited on the land 45, 50 million years ago. The rocks on the bottom, 80-million-year-old rock deposited in the ocean. And the story goes is that in 2012, there were two paleontologists, a man named David Starr and a man named Jim Geddert, were out at Fossil Bay looking for ammonites. Ammonites are the animals that look like a cinnamon roll, the nice curly Q. Very widespread, thousands of species, from ones that are very tiny to the biggest that are about 6 feet across. They're related to squid and octopi. And by the way, if you ever are at SeaTac Airport, and you're not going to find the sloth, but if you go into the food court there, the new food court, I guess it's not new anymore, in Concourse A, and you look on the walls, there's sort of a tannish limestone there. It's a German limestone, about 175 million years old, and you look at it, you will see ammonite fossils in that. So look for either parts of, you look for whole cinnamon rolls cut in half, or parts of cinnamon rolls. And then there's food right next door. But those are there. So it's sort of neat. You can find them pretty close. So they were out there looking for ammonites, and they find this bone right here. Now, if I had seen this bone right here, I would have thought, yeah, that's great. It looks like everything else, a bunch of gray mud or sediment there. Well, they recognized, having spent a lot of time out there looking for fossils, that it was unusual. They weren't sure if it was from a dinosaur or from a marine reptile. Dinosaurs and marine reptiles are two different things. Dinosaurs are land-based animals. Marine reptiles are the ones you think of, I hate to say this, but think of Nessie, Loch Ness, that sort of long-necked body. Those are sort of the classic marine reptile. And then if it's a reptile that's flying, it's neither a dinosaur nor a marine reptile. It's the flying one. It's a pterosaur. But they looked at it, saw that it was different, get hold of the Burke Museum. The Burke sends out a team. And it's hard to tell, but this area where they are, this beach, is only exposed at low tide. So the Burke gets out there, the 3 or 4 people, they've got a variety of tools, and they have about 6 hours to excavate this bone right here. It's on state park land. They had a permit to do it. And just as the tide's coming in, they're just almost done. They have to actually break the bone. So it's hard to tell, but this red line right here, this is where they had to break the bone to get the to get it all out. So basically what you're looking at, as you can see here, is it's the top part of a femur of some sort of animal. So they collect it, they bring it back to the Burke. They recognize immediately that it's a dinosaur because of the pattern of the bone. First dinosaur ever found in Washington State. So what do? They put it in the basement and ignore it, because it's not really interesting at all. Scientifically, there's nothing interesting about this. Time passes. Eventually, Burke administration gets hold of this and like, oh my God, this is exciting. So they give money to this young man who's in the previous photo, Brandon. Brandon goes around and compares the bone to other dinosaur bones around the country and in Canada. And he determines that this animal, this bone, he thinks is from a relative of Tyrannosaurus rex, a tyrannosaurid, as paleontologists would call it. Clearly not T-Rex, because this rock is 80-million-year-old rock, and T-Rex lived 67, 66 million years ago. So a much, much younger, very recent animal relative to this other one, 80 million years. But we knew that's what they knew. That's what he was able to determine, And that's it. That is the extent of the scientific information provided by this bone. Not really that interesting, but the story behind it, I think, is astounding. And I want to tell you the story and why we really put it in the book, not just because we wanted a dinosaur in the book. So dinosaurs, as I said, are land-based animals, and the bone was found in marine sediments. So it's as if the bone were found off the Olympic Peninsula out in the ocean. How did it get there? Well, that's an interesting story. We don't know for sure, but the hypothesis is that the animal is on land, dies on land, maybe near a river, and either the entire body, part of the body, something was washed out into the sea, floats down into that marine sediment, gets preserved, and then somehow all that rock gets uplifted and brought back to the surface. So the fact that we even found this bone, I think, is astounding. The other part is that that dinosaur did not live ever in what we would call Washington State. I said Washington was a jigsaw puzzle. Well, the rocks that make up Susha Island were attached to Washington as part of that whole conveyor belt of plate tectonics, so these little layers being moved onto the end of the continent. So we don't know where that animal lived. Did it live to the further west, further south? We don't know. All we know is it didn't live here, and it died 80 million years ago. So that part of the story, I think, is pretty astounding, that you've got the chances of it being found and that it didn't even live here, and it came to stay with us, which is pretty cool. So the ammonites, though, are really the interesting part of the story. As I said, generally they look like cinnamon rolls, this nice curly-Q shape, but we also have ones on the island that are straight ones. But what they provide is the key tidbit of information. They help provide the timing, because we know when these animals lived from looking at them in other rocks that we were able to age date, and we know what type of the environment was that they lived in. So they provide the details that allowed us to sort of pull together the bigger story of what was going on Susha Island, or at least on the Susha Island rocks. And again, each of these exemplifies what we were trying to do. The book's not just about fossils, it's not just about people, it's not about geology, it's about all these different things coming together to, as I said, to help develop better connections, to bring these animals to life. And for me, I will just end to say, again, even though Liz isn't here, it was just very much an honor to work with her on this project, to be brought into that fold of paleontology and share the story. So I will end on that note, and I will make two other just happy to answer questions. As Ginny said, there's some books for sale, but more importantly, I'm happy to answer questions, and I think we're going to have people speak into mics. Is that correct? We have mic runners. Is that the term you all use? So thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah, there's one right. Yes, Helen.
Who owns these findings?
Oh, good question. Who owns the fossils? So most of the fossils, and that's actually an interesting part of the technology aspect of the story. Most of the fossils are Washington State. If a fossil is found on public land, it's not yours. If you find it on private land, you can basically do what you want. But all the public fossils end up usually in a state repository. The Burke Museum is the repository for fossils. So almost everything that's in the book is in the Burke Museum. And one of the things that was great was Liz had gotten acquired this very high-tech camera that would shoot multiple depths of field of a single specimen and then sandwich it all technologically into one image. So when you look at the fossils, the entire fossil is in focus. So it was just they really stand out, the images. But yeah, it's all owned by, it's all at the Burke right now. So if you go to the Burke, I mean, if you've been there recently and you see back all those rows and rows of storage units, it's pretty impressive. I mean, there's dozens of things there. Yeah.
Do all vertebrates have a common ancestor?
Ooh, do all vertebrates have a common ancestor? I would say yes. I am not the paleontologist, but I would say yes. They certainly, yeah, because it all has to do with the notochord or something like that. Yeah. Ooh, how about that? So yes. Yeah, and Gordon over here says it, so trust him. He knows. He looks a lot smarter than I am. I know he is. So, other questions? You have a question.
I do. So, David, my whole entire life I've been collecting rocks, and I have a number of them up in my apartment. My favorite ones I brought here. In looking at them, is there any way I can tell that it might be a fossil versus just a rock?
That's an interesting question, is to tell what it is. I mean, sometimes, it's obvious. It looks like a fossil. There's evidence of bone material. There's something that looks like a leaf. But certainly through time, people have found things that they thought were fossils and were not fossils. At the Burke, we have these they're called clay babies, I think, and it looks like they look sort of like an organism, but it's just a bunch of clay all molded together. And probably the most famous, again, showing my level of my immaturity or juvenile humor, is in Washington there are these very famous quote-unquote coprolites, or fossilized poop. And everyone thinks they're fossilized poop because they look just like a poop that's been fossilized. But it turns out they're not. There's no evidence that they are from any animal. They think that it's just mud that got squeezed through a crack. I'm not going to go there. But yeah, I mean, someone who you should be, I mean, to me, there's certain ones will be obvious and certain ones you'll definitely have questions about. And the Burke, I don't know if the Burke does it still. They used to have a fossil ID day where you could bring stuff to the museum and they would identify it. I don't know if they do it because I'm not associated with the Burke anymore. Technically, I have an association, but I don't do anything. Yes?
Do you feature the Ginkgo Museum and the marvelous fossils there?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, we have one of the chapters does talk about ginkgos. Ginkgo, the leaves there, and the discovery of the person who found them, and the story behind that. And that, to me, the other aspect of that story that's wonderful is these trees that have had very little change over millions of years. So if you go to the sculpture park, you can see ginkgo trees, and the leaves look very similar to what the ones were here millions of years ago. But yeah, we do cover that story. It's a really great one. And so one of the other aspect of that story is one of the things I was interested in, just being me, is what was the first fossil found in what we call Washington State? And it's in the book. So I'm not going to tell you, because you want to buy the book. But the first from a non-native, but we know that indigenous people were using petrified wood back thousands of years. So there's a record of using fossils for thousands of years in Washington State. Who found the first post-European, non-native to find it? Sort of a fun story too. But you'll have to buy the book.
I would encourage everybody to go to the Ginkgo Museum there at Vantage. It's one of the most remarkable exhibits. Almost nobody knows anything about it. It's really worth a visit.
All right. Thank you. You've heard it there. Yes.
It's quicker if you want to look at some fossils. We have some in apartment 3X, some highly polished and others which are not. But they're all from the Sahara Desert in Morocco. So.
The other place, if you want to find fossils, if you go to the Grand Hyatt Hotel at 7th and Pine, one of those two, and you go in, well, it's much harder now. I went in the other day to see if I could do it. You used to be able to go into the bathrooms, and the walls of the bathrooms are the same German limestone that's at the airport. You can find it there. The other spot is up at the Swedish Cherry Hill branch, the hospital. Not that you really want to go there, but I've had to go there for various things for family members. And walking around looking at the floor, and it's like, oh, there's all these cool fossils in the floor. So there are fossils in many buildings, or not many, a handful of buildings in Seattle. And I've spent far too much time trying to find them. But that's me. Yeah.
Well, you don't even have to go anywhere. Just go to the front desk and look at the slab of rock, and you're going to find all kinds of fossils.
Oh, wow, there it is. Wow, how exciting. Learn something new. I'm going to send everyone here now.
Can you tell us a tale about a sloth? I know nothing about sloths, and I've been looking at that one on the screen, and I want to know more.
Okay, tell a tale about a sloth. So, as I said, this was the sloth that was found at SeaTac. The sloths were related to the modern sloth. One thing that's interesting about sloths, they were here, as I said, basically the same time as mammoths and mastodons. Mammoths and mastodons came to North America from Asia, from Siberia. They crossed over that land bridge. The sloths came to North America from South America. So they're southern visitors who came up here, migrants, if you will, came up. They're all migrants. We're all migrants. They came into this area. The big, massive claws for digging. They were not, unlike the sloths, that modern sloths that hang out in trees, there weren't a lot of trees around that could hold up an animal that's 8 feet tall. So they were definitely ground-dwelling animals. But we've got a handful of specimens of them. One of the things that's interesting, the sloth, the scientific name of the sloth, if I remember, I think is Megalonyx jeffersoni. And that sloth was named for Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson, one of the things he was so unlike certain people as president. When he sent Lewis and Clark to the west, one of the things he wondered is, are there big animals out there? Are there things like mammoths and mastodons? Because they had started to find these specimens. And he had been involved with finding this sloth, and initially thought it was related more to, I think, to either a bear or a big cat. Eventually figures out from reading some scientific papers that it wasn't. But so he's honored by that. So our sloth is this Jefferson, named for Thomas Jefferson. So those are some sloth tales, all in the book, but much more coherent and less political. I get in trouble, so I'm my as I figured, I'm my father's son, so. Yes, there's a question right back there. All right, how exciting.
What's a spirit whale?
What is a spirit whale? So the spirit whale, one of the things that's interesting about Washington is we don't have a lot of fossils. I mean, we don't have like go to Montana and there are fossils everywhere. You can't help but finding them. But what we have is this incredible diversity, because we have the diversity of ecosystems that have been preserved over time. And one of the types of ecosystems, we have preserved whales. So we have very important fossils from the time when whales first started to split into two different groups. You're probably familiar, there are toothed whales and there are baleen whales. And right at that time of the split, evolution seemed to have worked very quickly at that time. And in Washington, we have a bunch of whales from that period. And one of them has been named the spirit whale. It's the name that was just given to it, again, to honor it comes from an indigenous name that the animal is also named the scientific name. But the whales are arguably the most interesting fossils we have in Washington, particularly from a scientific point of view, of really helping to flesh out that story of the early whales. And just to think also that the whales are still obviously so important. So that long-running thread of millions of years of time, we still see at present, whales obviously being very important. Yeah. Oh, here comes our mic.
Has the bison changed much over the years?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So our bison think of a modern bison. If you've been to Yellowstone or any of those places, you put your honey on your kid so that the kid would be attracted to the bison, or vice versa. No, I'm sure you didn't do that. You're not supposed to. Our bison the bison back then were about 1.5 to 2 times bigger than the modern bison. So these were huge animals, and we find them in a variety of places. And one of the places that there's a really interesting bison is out on Orcas Island. And what makes it interesting primarily is that it's on an island. So how did it get to that island? We know that big mammals swim, but we also know that during the last ice age, the water was taken. All that ice that was on Earth meant there was much less water in the ocean. Why we're concerned right now with all the glaciers melting, sea level comes up. When it's in ice, sea levels goes down. So much lower sea level, several hundred feet lower than it was now. And so maybe that space between what we call Orcas and the mainland was closer. Maybe they could have walked. Maybe they could have swum a much shorter distance. But the fact that there are these giant bison on Orcas is a fun story. But yeah, so about 1.5 to 2 times bigger. So big, big animal. Well, it's 5 p.m, and rumor has it lunch is coming up. I just want to say again, thank you all for coming out. And again, I'll make my 2 self-promotional things. I do have this newsletter that comes out every week. It's a free weekly newsletter. There's information. If you go to my website, Geology Writer, there's information on the postcard on how to do it. It's really fun for me to do that. And to me, what I love about it is it allows me to continue to engage with people. I have copies of Spirit Whales for sale, $25 cash, check, or charge, or all 3, as I said earlier. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.